Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. The presidential election, the good, the bad, and the crazy. We'll talk about it with one of the wisest observers of American politics, the former president of Demos and of Common Cause, who is now a senior advisor to Common Cause, Miles Rappaport. Miles, welcome.
Okay,
so great
glad to be here.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming in. So this is an election like none of us have ever seen before. We have a nominee, in this case a presumptive nominee of one of the major parties. We've never seen one where the nominee is so, in my view, fundamentally unfit and unqualified to be president of the United States as Donald Trump. Why has he done as well as he's done?
You know, I think there are two things that stand out for me about his candidacy. One is that, you know, he sort of embodies the reality TV era, you know, just sort of creating a personality for yourself that's bigger than life and then living up to it. And I think people now are responding to that. But the second thing is, I do think that he is the embodiment and the ultimate expression of trends within the Republican Party that have been 40 years in the making. You know, going back to Lee Atwater and the Southern Strategy, I think the Republican Party has, you know, kind of created for itself, dug for itself a hole in which, you know, a lot of what they have won elections on have been negative characterizations, whether it's of gay Americans or African Americans or Latinos or women. And I think somehow he's embodied all of that in one boastful and loud personage.
I've always thought that the GOP has been given largely a pass on that for the longest time. I mean, I don't think the media has focused on it properly or enough. Commentators have not zeroed in on it. And it seems to me, because I agree with you about Trump, it seems to me that Trump has not so much pushed the envelope as just changed the language about the same old thing that the Republican Party has stood for. So why has the party been able to get away with it for so long?
You know, I think they've specialized in, you know, what Ian Haney Lopez calls dog whistle racism and dog whistle politics, right. And been able to kind of evoke negative imagery about and otherize people in order to build a kind of white and largely male base for the party. And I think for a long time that worked reasonably well. But I think what's happening right now is that the electorate has changed dramatically, and the country has gotten more tolerant, and the millennials are very different in how they think about all these issues. And so it's now very largely a minority, in the true sense of the word, right. View, and I don't think it's going to sell very well this election.
You mentioned Lee Atwater. He, of course, the late Lee Atwater, he, of course, was a top GOP strategist and advisor both to Ronald Reagan and to George H.W. Bush. And essentially what he said was, you know, the party, you can't say the N-word anymore, that gets you in trouble, he said. So you have to look to these other issues that get you to the same place. That's the dog whistle politics you're talking about. So if you want to express bigotry or racism or whatever, you have to talk about school busing or cutting taxes or who knows, whatever other issues. And Trump just comes out there and just blurts it out seemingly off the top of his head. It sounds as though, as you talk about the way the country has changed and the changing demographics, it sounds as though you don't think that Donald Trump can get elected in this environment. Is that so? And if that's the case, explain a little more why.
It is the case. I think absent a kind of dramatic, kind of asteroid-like event right. in the election between now and November, you know, I think that the base that he is working from is extremely narrow. You know, it was a majority of Republican primary voters, which is a largely white, you know, often Southern base of that party. Interestingly, he does appeal, he's trying to appeal to kind of white working class voters. And there's real economic grievance, real sense that the system is rigged and it isn't working for people. And in that one way, I think he's tapped into some of the same sentiments that Bernie Sanders has tapped into.
Now, Hillary Clinton is obviously far more qualified to be president than Donald Trump is, but from the perspective of progressives or progressive politics. I mean, she's somewhat problematic. So can you talk about that a little bit?
You know, I'm one of the people who believe that her basic underlying instincts are quite progressive. I think that's where she originally came from. I think, unfortunately, in some ways, she's been really part of the system and part of the inner workings of the Democratic Party for a long time, including the period where, you know, her husband Bill created the Democratic Leadership Council as a specific way of pulling the Democratic Party to the right and making it more business friendly. And I think the zeitgeist, if I can say that, this year is much more to say these issues: inequality, a rigged campaign finance system, and efforts to prevent people from voting. Those are front and center in this year's politics, and I think that's one of the reasons that Bernie Sanders has done so well, and one of the reasons. And I'm very happy that these are issues now that are really being discussed in a big way in the campaign.
So you're right. Bernie Sanders sort of embodies that zeitgeist that you're talking about. One of the surprises, I think, is that the country has become as liberal or as progressive as it has. But did you think that Bernie Sanders would do well? Forget whether you thought that he might almost snatch the nomination, which he almost did, but did you think when he announced that he would do well?
I really didn't. I have to give him an enormous amount of credit. He surprised me very much in just how much he was able to build a tremendous base of support on fundraising, and especially the way he was able to appeal to young people. I mean, the Democratic Party and all of us who are involved in democracy issues, as I've been for 30 or 40 years, have sort of despaired that young people were not, you know, jumping in and really taking hold of electoral politics, and he's dramatically changed that this year. So I give him an enormous amount of credit, and I think he deserves to have major influence in the party as it goes forward.
So now we're in a delicate period, though, because he deserves to have major influence because of all the votes, all the people who voted for him. But what is it you think that he really wants, and do you ultimately expect him, I mean, I'm sure he'll support Secretary Clinton, but do you ultimately expect him to be enthusiastic in his support?
You know, I think I do. I do think that, and I think trends are moving in that direction. I think first and foremost what he wants, and I take him at his word, I think he's been true to it for 40 years, is the issue. He wants the issues that he has campaigned on: economic inequality, the disappearing middle class, the ways in which the 1% have dominated our economic life and our political life, the ways in which people have been victimized by the racism in the criminal justice system. I think he wants those issues to be front and center. I think he wants Hillary not just to say yes to them, but to wholeheartedly embrace them, campaign on them, and then govern on them when she is president, which I believe she will be.
So let's talk about inequality. There's both wealth and income inequality. They're both at extreme levels. These disparities have not been seen since before the Great Depression.
Right.
I talk to so many people, ordinary people, not politicians or people in government or economists, who feel that one of two things. One, they don't realize that this is unusual or even that there's anything really wrong with this, or if they do find it troubling, feel that there's nothing to be done about it, that this is just the way of the world or the way of the country or whatever. What would you say to them?
So I think part of it is just really showing just how unequal we are. I actually think we're now more unequal as a society, income-wise, than we've been since 1913, when the income tax was created. Right. But I think the real issue, I think you've put your finger on it, is that people don't really believe anything can be done about it, and they certainly don't, you know, after 30 years of having government being demonized, don't really believe the government can do it, but in fact the government's the only thing that can do it.
Right.
So I think that there is a whole set of policies that are at the level of boldness, and maybe even beyond, you know, that Bernie Sanders has been talking about in terms of, you know, how you create jobs, the investment in infrastructure, the closing of the tax loopholes, the regulation of Wall Street and all of its ways that it has extracted money to the financial end of the economy, that we need to go and take seriously and fight for. And I think that's really, really important, and I'm hopeful it will happen.
You mentioned infrastructure. It's a pet issue of mine, and I really don't understand this country's reluctance to just engage that issue. We know we need to, almost everybody knows that we need to rebuild the infrastructure in this country, the roads, the bridges, but also the dams, the ports, the electrical grid, I mean, just on and on, school buildings.
Schools.
This would be a wonderful source of tons of good new jobs, not low-paying jobs, but jobs that pay well. We're in a period when you could finance it less expensively almost than any other time because interest rates are at near record lows.
Right.
Why has neither party been willing to move in a big way on this issue?
You know, I think it's a hangover from the long period of government spending is the enemy. You know, Ronald Reagan expressed it most succinctly when he said the 8 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." You know, he ran his campaign and he governed as if government were the problem.
Right.
So I think what we have to do is really turn that around to say government can be, you know, run well and invested in properly, a major part of the solution. So I think spending that money to put people to work in good jobs, to rebuild that infrastructure, and to generate a real substance for the economy, I think is really important. And I think it's picking up steam. I think the deficit hawks, the people who said the biggest problem in the world is government spending, I think they're losing some of their currency because I think people are realizing we have to do something. Wall Street's not going to give it to us. Maybe we ought to try to trust the government again and have it do its job.
Right. Now, the big issue facing Hillary Clinton very soon now is the choice of a vice presidential running mate. Any thoughts on this? What is the type of candidate that she really needs that would be really helpful to her, either in terms of the campaign itself, winning the election, or moving forward, governing?
Well, it's interesting. This is a really emblematic, pivotal moment, I think, for her. We've seen articles in the last few days about how Wall Street is warning her. If she chooses Elizabeth Warren as her running mate, those contributions will dry up.
Right.
Which is, in a sense, it's the essence of the problem. It is the essence of the problem, which is, what are we going to do if Wall Street doesn't contribute to the campaign? So she's going to have to decide if the 50 million or 100 million or whatever it is that Wall Street is going to contribute is really worth her sacrificing what I think she needs to do, which is to project a bold, new economic narrative and understand and embrace the need for changing the way our democracy runs, because the democracy's deficits and failures are what has made it impossible for the economic problems to be solved.
Now, Elizabeth Warren would certainly do that. Would that be a good pick politically?
I think it would be an excellent choice. I think Elizabeth Warren is someone who has shown that she's both extremely knowledgeable about Wall Street financial matters, and that she's courageous and bold and not somebody who shies away from a fight. So I think picking her would do wonders towards bringing the party together, making the people who have supported Bernie Sanders really feel good about it. Don't know if she's going to do it, but if I were advising her, I would tell her she absolutely should.
That would be your number one choice.
She would be my number one choice.
Is there anyone else that you think would be good? I mean, some of the names that are out there are Sherrod Brown of Ohio, Tim Kaine of Virginia, Julian Castro of Texas. Any of those names excite you? I
think, you know, two of those have real arguments to be made for them, in my mind. One, Sherrod Brown, because I do think he carries some of that populist cachet.
So you lose the Senate seat.
Right, there's a risk there, but I'm talking about as for the vice presidential candidate.
But the same thing would happen with Elizabeth Warren.
Yes, although I understand there's something in Massachusetts law that might be able to
mitigate
that.
Yeah, okay.
And I think Joaquin Castro and Julian Castro are you know, also potentially really good choices, because I do think that they embody the new American electorate. Tim Kaine, in my mind, is more the same. You know what I mean? I think that taking a safe, you know, moderate governor, whether it's Tim Kaine or John Warner, to me doesn't give Hillary very much of what I think at least she needs and should have if she's not only going to win the election but also then govern.
He's also not a very exciting candidate.
Right.
Yeah. Voting rights has been a big issue with you for what I think are obvious reasons. The GOP has been doing everything it can to suppress the vote, especially among racial and ethnic minorities, among young people, progressives, and that sort of thing. Instead of making it easier to vote, we're actually making it harder to vote. I mean, the Voting Rights Act has been gutted by the Supreme Court. What are the steps we need to start taking right now to just make it easier across the board for Americans to vote? And who should lead that effort?
I think the president should lead. Even though many of the laws that govern how people vote are done at the state level. Nevertheless, I think leadership from the president and from Washington would be a really, really important thing. You know, I think that there's a whole suite of policies, from same-day voter registration to automatic voter registration to restoring the voting rights for people who have been convicted of a felony, to pre-registration of 17 and 18-year-olds, to online registration, to early voting, all of which taken as a whole could really, really boost the turnout. And I'm a huge believer in the idea that if the electorate, the people who actually vote, genuinely mirrors the population of the country, we'll have much, much better outcomes. So I would say whether it's to a governor of a state or to Congress and the president in the 2017, let's move those agenda items and let's do it. And at the same time, let's really take steps to limit the overwhelming influence of money in our politics.
So you just touched on it, but can you talk about it a little more about the importance of actually voting? Now, I'm a big fan of movements, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, going all the way back to the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the labor movement. I tell people, get engaged. It's really important. But it's also so important to just actually get out there and cast your vote. Now, you had big turnouts among progressives and among ethnic minorities, among blacks, among Latinos, et cetera, that elected Barack Obama to 2 terms as president. But in the off-year elections in between, that turnout wasn't there. And we ended up with Republican control of both houses of Congress. So talk a little bit about how important it is to actually cast your vote.
I think it's incredibly important. I think for a long time, even people in the community organizing movement who had Saul Alinsky training thought, well, it's not that important to vote because there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties, and what we really have to do is organize and mobilize. And I totally believe that, and I think it's important. But we are at a very different moment in the country where there is a gigantic difference between the two parties on almost everything, from gun control to regulating Wall Street, to voting rights, to campaign finance reform, to the basic issues of taxation and the minimum wage and economic inequality. So for people who say, well, it doesn't really affect me, especially if it's not a presidential year, I think it really, really does. And I think what has to happen is, A, you have to take away all the barriers, because I do think that one of the biggest reasons people don't vote is they don't know how, or they're not registered, nobody's contacting them, et cetera. And then we have to wage campaigns and govern as if in a way that really matters to people's lives. If people see that politics matters to their lives, I think they'll come out and vote. I never have believed that people are apathetic or don't care. I just think they have lost faith, as you said, that this can really make a difference in their lives, and it can. Now,
you mentioned campaign financing, and that, of course, has been a cornerstone of Bernie Sanders' campaign. If you spend 15 minutes looking at this issue, you see that it's a form of legalized bribery. I mean, I think it's like thievery where the villains don't even have to put masks on. Explain how this, again, I think much of the public doesn't understand this well. Explain how this legalized bribery actually takes place. Explain the importance to those making the donations, the importance of campaign financing.
I'd say it operates in 3 ways. One, it discourages people, the fact that you have to raise that much money to run for a congressional office or a Senate office, not to mention the presidency, discourages qualified people who don't have either money themselves or access to money from running. So that's number one. It skews the pool of candidates to people who are independently wealthy or operate in circles where people are wealthy. Secondly, the candidates, as they are raising money, all they're doing night and day, and we've seen all the studies about, senators are spending 40% of their time going in some little cubicle at the DNC or the RNC raising money. What's debilitating about that is that they're not calling people who are having trouble paying their bills or who are having health care issues or can't afford child care for their kids. They're talking to people who can give them $2,600 or now with Citizens United far more than that. And the problems of the rich become the problems of the candidates, which then become the problems of the representatives and senators. So from the donor's point of view, they're giving money and, it doesn't need to be a quid pro quo, but what they're buying is the ability that when they have a problem and they make a phone call and they can say, by the way, I gave you $10,000 for your campaign, that phone call is going to get answered right away. And I think that we have just skewed all of the issue discussion up until now, to the issues that are cared about most by the rich and by the business community.
But that access is profound, isn't it? I mean, how often have we seen where on some of the biggest issues of the day, issues that would directly affect ordinary working individuals and families, the legislation is actually written by those who are also writing the checks. I mean, and laws are passed that hurt ordinary people.
I mean, the most stunning example I've heard, and I may not have my exact facts right here, are that over the last 30 years, the capital gains tax has been, which affects 1% or half of 1% of the population, has been lowered 10 times. And the minimum wage, again, up until now, hasn't been raised at all. It's just declined and declined and declined. So you have millions of people who are dependent on the minimum wage or whose wages are just above that, who are counting for nothing, and this tiny population who are getting billions of dollars. Why? Because the political system has been skewed so that their needs are what Congress is working on.
So what can we do about campaign finance?
Well, two things. Short term, I think that states, even municipalities, can enact, and Congress, can enact a public financing set of laws that would allow small donors to have much more influence in campaigns and would allow candidates to run and appeal to voters rather than to donors. Secondly, long term, we've got to overturn Citizens United and the Buckley v. Vallejo case. Because go back to 1976 and the Buckley v. Vallejo case, which said that for James Buckley, spending unlimited amounts of his own money on campaigns was constitutionally protected free speech. All of the miserable decisions up through and including Citizens United flow from that. So we definitely need a new Supreme Court that will look and say, what hath we wrought on the issue of money in politics, and take a new look at it and reverse it. And I think that can happen. I think it will happen. I think we'll look back on the Buckley decision and the Citizens United decisions the way people look back on the Dred Scott decision, and they say, what in God's name was the Supreme Court thinking? So we've got to overturn Citizens United and Buckley, get a real campaign finance reform regime in place that favors small donors and allows candidates who don't have access to money to really get in the game.
We've got about a minute left, and we're coming to the end of 2 terms of Barack Obama as president. Many people thought that he would never make it to the White House. Assess his presidency and give me your opinion on how you think historians will look at his presidency.
I think historians will look very kindly on his presidency. I think that many things have moved forward. I think if he made any major mistake, it was to assume that somehow he could get Congress to cooperate with him when they had decided from day one, from day minus one,
very beginning,
that all they wanted to do was undercut his precedents. Nevertheless, in terms of health care, in terms of the environment, in terms of labor rights, and through executive orders, not just legislation, I think he's advanced and helped the society to advance. So
and preventing us from going into a depression, saving the auto industry.
Yes, yes, all those things, and building an economy back that had been taken to the cleaners by Wall Street.
Right. Miles Rappaport, thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob. Delighted to be here.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. Much of the American West and Southwest is on fire. Several people have died in a heat wave that has driven temperatures to 120 degrees and beyond in some places. Wildfires, either sparked or worsened by the intense heat, have driven people from their homes in at least 3 states. Record-setting temperatures have made this the hottest start to the summer ever in Arizona, New Mexico, and California. Even at night, there has been hardly any relief. Meanwhile, researchers in Australia have reported that rising sea levels have wiped out a rodent population that once had thrived in a section of the Great Barrier Reef. As the New York Times reported, this was the first documented extinction of a mammal due to human-induced climate change. Canary in the coal mine, anyone? For those who still don't believe in global warming, last year, 2015, was the hottest year on record. The previous hottest year was 2014. We're already on track this year to beat both of those records. I wonder how much evidence we're going to need before we begin to take serious steps to mitigate this climate catastrophe that is already upon us. That's all for now. See you next time.